You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther, Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll break down Lagos State's 2020 budget and discuss funding options as well as explore ways to attract investments into Africa's 7th largest economy. As always, you can join today's conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can also send your thoughts, your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. Nigeria's commercial capital, Lagos State, is proposing a 2020 spending plan of 1.17 trillion naira. Now, the appropriation bill presented by Governor Babajide Sanwo-Olu is 34% higher than that of the 2019 budget and will be funded by a projected 1.1 trillion naira total revenue. Samuel Egube, Commissioner for Economic Planning and Budget in Lagos State, joins me now to unpack the budget and also to discuss funding options as well as to explore ways to attract investment into the state. Samuel, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
Yes, nice. Happy to be here too myself.
Before we break down, crunch the numbers for 2020, I would just like us to just quickly start off quickly with the 2019 budget. We're in November now. The year has almost ended. So just bring us up to speed on the progress so far, the budget performance, what's been spent, and how the numbers have gone so far.
Okay, it's been an interesting 2019, and the government, upon coming into office in May, eventually signed the budget in June. So you see that we're already halfway gone in the year. Today, the budget performance stands at about 69%, okay, which is about 450 billion in total expenditure spending. The revenue is 468, and there we are 78% performance. And then the recurrent expenditure is around 232, which is about 79% performance. So overall, we'll say we're at 69% performance. But we've then taken steps through a reordered bill, which we had proposed to the House of Assembly, and graciously they've approved, okay, to basically then challenge ourselves around critical areas that we can quickly ramp up on the capex spend. Okay. So we expect that by the time we get to December, the budget performance should have hit somewhere in the 80s or high 80s to 90s.
Okay. Now, for the 2019 budget, when it comes to spending, when it comes to developing the state, what are, I mean, since we're still in 2019, those key critical development area or priority development areas for the state? Okay,
so basically we still stayed around our themes agenda. We still pushed quite a lot of money into healthcare and into roads. Okay. Even though it's late in the day, we triggered off the roads, but the provision for road spending remained strong. You'll recall that we recently just launched and commissioned the mother and child care at Alimosho and at Etiosa, because we need to focus also on our children and our mothers and on healthcare generally. Again, we had launched the recycling program, which we call Blue Box. It's our view all the time that if waste is sorted properly from the home, then it is easier to manage around the metropolis. We believe that the environment actually is the preventive option for healthcare, where the hospitals become more curative. We also completed the 492 units of housing estate at Igondo in Alimosho State, because Alimosho local government. Because again, housing is part of our plan. You can't talk of all of these people coming into Lagos and not have a housing plan for them. These are some of the programs which we have launched. Some are still ongoing, like the courthouses, which will soon commission, and the police command.
Okay, if I could just come in here. I mean, this is a state of with a population of about, I mean, give or take 20 million people. And I knew that obviously generating revenue is key. And I mean, if one just thinks about it, at least for Lagos State, IG, when it comes to internally generated revenue, Lagos State does generate a significant amount. That being said, I mean, also looking at the numbers in terms of the number of people, Lagosians, who actually pay taxes. And I remember some of the comments you made recently in the media where you said, give or take about 400,000 Lagosians pay taxes and those within the tax bracket way more than that, somewhere between 700 to 1 million. And I'm just wondering, for a population of 20 million, Tell us how your IGR, how you generate this revenue, and how you're able to cope with this very low rate of tax participation.
So generally, it's difficult to cope with low tax participation. And just to make a correction, it's not really 400. It's what I call effective.
Effective, okay.
Yes, when you say really, because some people, when you need a transaction, you get a tax card, you make a payment, and they don't see you again. So that's not effective. So when you take the entire enrollment and then look at it, and you weigh it, put a weight around it, is the reason why I had used the numbers 400, right? But the truth is that on a tax to GDP ratio, Lagos is still doing 1%. The nation, Nigeria, which is really, really underperforming, does as much as 6% of its GDP. South Africa about 27, Egypt about 15, Ghana here about 15%. So technically, we potentially should be able to do 15 times more than what we are doing. And so even though we think that Lagos is generating a whole lot of IGR, when you look at the IGR per capita, it's not a whole lot. And so we still need to do more in that area to support our budget going forward.
Is that a priority area? Because I know that, technology certainly can help you achieve that.
Yeah, at the spine of the budget, when we look at the thrust of our budget and the administration going forward, we're going to invest disproportionately in efforts, right, that help us generate revenue on the tax side. The truth is that a lot of the market in Lagos is still gray, is still informal. And once it's informal, you find it a little more challenging bringing it into the tax bracket. So when we look at the entire housing market, which is a commanding height area for Lagos, you see that a lot of it is gray. When you look at transportation, it's a huge industry in Lagos, but how much of them do they pay taxes? Or again, when you look at our markets, we have some of the largest markets in West Africa, but how much tax comes out of these places? So technology is the way to go, and we will get enumeration going, we will get incentives going, and we will get people engaged and participate in contributing to the tax.
Let's go right into the 2020 budget proposal. Okay. So the state is proposing a 1.16 trillion Naira budget, could you just talk us through that? Because it's going to be funded with a revenue of 1.071 trillion. So that leaves a deficit of 97.53 billion. Talk to us about this.
Okay, so at the base of the broad objective of the state is to encourage citizens' participation and therefore to lead the people not the way we think they should be led, but the way they want to be led, right? And so we'll provide a lot of leadership to them, a lot of engagement. The other thrust of the objective is our development of our human capacity. Because if the people themselves are not developed, then you can't do the production that causes that capacity to grow. So in that area, we'll be focusing on education, we'll be focusing on health, and we'll be focusing on the environment. But business only thrives when the ease of doing business is strong. And we had started a lot of work on that, and that's why you see we've gone up almost 15 points and by the World Bank in doing business, ease of doing business index. That is largely driven by Lagos, and we'll continue to push that narrative to ensure the ease of doing business gets stronger. But again, when business thrives, they cannot thrive with weak infrastructure. So we're going to aggressively pursue both production and maintenance of our public infrastructure.
Is that why the budget is this year's 2020 budget is 34% higher than what we saw for this year?
That is why it's higher, that more, because there's going to be an increased focus on our capital spend around infrastructure.
So does that mean an increase in borrowing?
Not necessarily. What we have done is that we have try to increase our internally generated revenue by looking to 886, by basically looking at our potential. But if you notice, this year we have done some borrowing already. We may not be able to spend all of that effectively, given the time to the year end. So we'll be bringing some of that forward, which would help us start early in the 2020 budget execution program. So all that put together is what will help us deliver on the budget.
What about, I mean, the debt servicing of the state, as a ratio to the revenue of the state? Is that at the sustainable levels at the moment?
Well, it's at sustainable levels. At the moment, 2029, we shall close it at about 29%, which is still very strong and within the levels of 30% and maybe 40% when you're looking at the federal government's guidelines around that. But in 2020, it will have come down significantly to about 21%, because you can see the deficit is much smaller and the production should have gone up.
Okay. Now, looking at the text of the 2020 budget put out by the Office of the Governor, just looking at some of the objectives, at the top of that list is to attract private sector investments to the state. Now, obviously, this is key, not just for Lagos State, for the entire other states and, of course, the country as a whole. Talk to us on what the state is doing specifically now, those specific steps taken to attract private investments, because you're talking about spending, so obviously the government cannot do it all, transportation, critical infrastructure, etc. I'm just wondering, how much participation from the private sector do we have at the moment?
So it will be very, very strong. It's one of the pillars of our going forward strategy to ensure we leverage our PPP office significantly to get all our programs going. I'm sure you must have noticed the governor have been traveling quite a bit, and in another 1 week, we'll be, in a few days, we'll be traveling again. All of that are to close into partnerships around the world that will help us on the public-private partnership end of the game. We just closed one, the Lekki Deep Seaport, okay, with China Harbour. That was also PPP. And we continue to do this. Our Lagos Global Office, which is an office that basically midwives and holds investors into Lagos through the system, is quite active in all of this. And our PPP office also have been strengthened. So we will not be doing a lot of all of the things on our balance sheet. We'll be doing some through different forms of partnerships. Okay. In a few weeks, we shall advertise again for some of our critical infrastructure, some of our rail infrastructure around our rail master plan, and some of our road infrastructure as well for private parties to express interest. Okay. So we're actively engaging in that.
Now, these are things we're going to talk extensively on in this other half of the show. So at this point, we're just going to take a break. I must thank you for your time so far. Thank you for being here. I've been speaking to Samuel Egube. He's a commissioner for economic planning and budget in Lagos State. We're unpacking the state's 2020 budget. Still with me is Samuel Egube. He's a commissioner for economic planning and budget for Lagos State. Thank you for your time so far. Let's pick it from where we left. We're talking about private sector involvement, participation, and this is something many states have been striving to increase. We've been seeing all the economic summits have been going on across states this year, or in the last few years, if you will. I know that Lagos State has done a lot of that. But in terms of the level of participation the state would like to see, could you talk to us about that? Is the state satisfied with the level of private sector involvement that we're seeing at the moment?
Okay, we would like to see more and more and more. As government, our focus and our focus really will be to get as much people involved in governance as possible. So when we talk about citizen engagement, we are not only talking about citizen engagement from the conversational side, but also from the investment side. We'd like to see more citizens invest in Lagos, but we also like to see external parties come into Nigeria, and Lagos is the gateway into Nigeria, and invest in Lagos. So we intend to grow that more aggressively. Like I said earlier, our PPP office have been reactivated very strongly. In addition, our Lagos Global Office has also been strengthened. And all of that is geared towards encouraging investors to come in and holding them through whatever there is within government.
Should we expect to see this PPP, the activation, should we expect to see them roll out across key sectors in the state? Energy, power, labor, etc.?
Certainly. There are key sectors which we've said are our priorities: transportation and traffic management, health, making Lagos a 21st century economy, technology and education, and governance, and then tourism. In tourism, we're looking at culture, we're looking at sports, we're looking at entertainment. So we will be very active and we'll see private sector participate in across this entire scope.
Now, talking about building a 21st century city, because we hear this, we hear these slogans from time to time, mega city, progressive, cosmopolitan city. And, one looks around sometimes and just sees the pressure on the infrastructure. Now, one thing I know that's happened in this state, as obviously you already know too, is the unchecked rapid urbanization that we're seeing. So many people are coming into Lagos. Lagos is seen as a state where you can come. Obviously, there are opportunities here where you can come and be successful. And this is something, obviously, the government cannot stop. So how is the government balancing that, ensuring that the infrastructure is upgraded as regularly as possible, and then even building new infrastructure to absorb this rapid urbanization that we continue to see?
Okay, at the heart of this is the recognition that Lagos is relatively doing better, because people definitely come into what they consider a better place, right? But that also puts pressure on the economy very strongly, and it speaks to the heart of the way we are organized as a federation. So if you do poorly, right, and therefore you lose your people, right, to a state that is doing better, you really lose nothing in federal allocation, right? And if more people come to you, it doesn't mean you get something more from like federal allocation. So that is at the heart of it. But having said that, we will continue to build infrastructure to ensure that all of these people are accommodated. But what is more important beyond infrastructure in the broad objectives which I laid out earlier is that you must develop the people for productivity. If the people are productive that come, then it's also better. The population becomes good. But if they are unproductive, then that population becomes a drain on the infrastructure and the resources of the state. Okay. So it's the reason why we want to drive education very aggressively from early education up to tertiary education and get the people prepared for industry.
Okay, let's go back to the hard infrastructure. You mentioned earlier, let's talk about housing quickly. You mentioned earlier that for this year, so far, over 400 units, 92 housing units have been built. I mean, compared to the population, that's obviously more can be done. So in that area, what is the plan of the state to aggressively ramp up? Obviously, the private investment has to come in. Is there anything you can tell us in terms of partnerships, anything in the pipeline to increase housing in Lagos State? Okay,
so yes, there are a lot of estates at different stages of completion which Lagos State is driving. And one of the things we said in terms of how we prioritize the 2020 budget is to prioritize it in favor of completing existing projects. If you do not complete existing projects, then the investment is locked up and the value in those investments are not unleashed for the benefit of the people. But we are going to work by ways of joint ventures across the landscape of the housing market. We just right now are trying to formalize that market and to ensure that we know the players and the capacities that are coming into market and drive it basically by technology and regulation. Once a market is organized, then investment is easier to undertake, right? Right now, that entire market is hardly formal. We need to formalize it. We need to create a pathway for investors to come in. Issues around land titling is crucial. And just recently, the governor had empowered certain commissioners, right, to also sign, which means getting C of O's and getting the consent of the governor on transactions gets to be faster. Basically, also, things around government are going to be faster in the way they move, right? Because, again, we're trying to build expertise in government, automate government processes, and ensure a very healthy interaction between the citizen and the government. Now, all of these just help. So when we go up in our ease of doing business, what it means is that Lagos becomes a destination to come invest in, because the government of Lagos State will be supportive, right, to businesses in doing those investments.
And key to powering most of this is power, energy. I know that Lagos State embarked on some, I don't know if it's IPPs, just to support, as it were, the national, what we get from the national grid. What can you tell us in terms of the investments that are going in there at the moment?
Okay, so today there are investments already, right, in IPPs, right? But there are challenges between generation and between distribution. And so even today, the amount of power that is generated that can be available to Lagos is not coming into Lagos because the basic distribution infrastructure is unable to take it, right? So Lagos State is talking very actively with the DISCOs and seeing areas of cooperation around existing approved schemes under the regulation to ensure that we're able to get power more. The first step would be to get the amount of power that is available in by joining with the DISCO to try and strengthen our distribution infrastructure.
Okay, I'm just wondering because, I mean, with all the plans that Lagos State has to become a mega city, I mean, all of that is going to be powered by electricity. If there isn't power, then, then there's no point. So I'm just thinking, apart from that, other sources, like renewable energy, just off-grid solutions, basically, is that also an option that the state is considering?
It's an option, but as we speak, like I told you, we're layering the solution. The real problem right now is not generation for Lagos. It's actually distribution. Because not all the power that is generated can be distributed within Lagos, right? So because there are different kind of issues facing that market, and even though there's a national regulator, we will intervene in those conversations to ensure that one step, community by community at a time, we will unleash power by partnering with the DISCOs and other private sector participants to strengthen the distribution network and then to get the power in on a regular basis. Sometimes those conversations are conversations around tariff. Sometimes those conversations are conversations around metering. And the government is trying to broker discussions with all kinds of parties to bring them to the table to reach an agreement that will allow power just flow to its people. I mean, Lagos must be powered because it's an industrial hub.
Now, just to recap some of the points you made earlier on the issue of, for instance, internally generated revenue, did you give us a number? I thought I heard you say over 800.
886 billion.
Is the plan to be generated this year? What's the difference between this year and the previous year?
Well, last year it was about 400.
Okay, so the plan is to almost double it?
Almost double it, yeah.
And is this going to come from with taxes?
Well, it's going to come from taxes, but it's not going to come necessarily from increased taxes.
Okay.
It's difficult to survive as a state if the commanding heights of your economy is not regulated, right? So if the entire transport system is not organized and regulated, how do you tax them? How do you collect even the tax, even if they are willing to pay, right? If your real estate, we say Lagos Oil is real estate and land. If the entire land and real estate sector is in the gray market, right? A large portion of it, how do you tax it or how do you collect your taxes from it? If our markets, I mean, we are known for our enterprise and our commerce, and if you can't tell how much transactions are going on in our markets, for example, how do you know what to estimate from them in taxes? So one of the things we want to be doing is to organize the markets, organize the real estate sector, organize the transport sector, and ensure that those markets are transparent. And out of that transparency, we'll then be able to size the capacity of that market and reach an agreement as to how to then collect the appropriate forms of taxes that are suitable for that market. We do recognize that you can't hit your maximum or optimal point from day one, but I think as you begin to contribute to what they require to grow their businesses in those sectors, as you begin to support them as government, they begin to see why they should contribute to government and development in where they do business through taxes or through levies. Okay,
let me ask you this. Is there a blue, I know that obviously the big picture is to make Lagos a mega city, 21st century city, but is there like a proper blueprint that we're working with right now? We're the seventh biggest, largest economy on the continent. Is there a plan in sight in terms of where we want to be, in terms of the big picture, the size of the economy we want to be, what we want to export as a state? Is it tourism? Is it culture?
Okay, so basically Lagos is not a state in the middle of the air. Lagos State has a development plan from 2012 to 2025.
Okay.
And that has been well thought out by our fathers, right, and past regimes, right? And what we are just doing is taking portions of that development plan and executing it. Now, the themes agenda is in line with that development plan. And yes, we want to be quite aggressive, and all of these elements really will be to make Lagos one of the top economies, right, in Africa. Today, people say we are really about seventh, given some of the traumas that went out in the last 2 years. We intend to come back to number 5 and then begin to push. we can actually be number 2, right? Where number 1 becomes Nigeria, right? So that is a tall order, but it requires significant changes in the way we think. We need to rethink our land use, the way we use our land, because it's a limited resource.
Well, are there ongoing reforms?
We need to, all of those reforms are ongoing in this government, and we should begin to see the outputs from next year.
Okay, Honorable Commissioner, I must thank you for your time. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
I've been speaking to Samuel Egube. He's the Honorable Commissioner for Economic Planning and Budget in Lagos State, and we've been unpacking the state's 2020 budget and, of course, looking at other issues within the state. That's our show for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch all previous episodes of Beyond Market on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Market. You can also send your thoughts and your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. Thank you so much for watching. From myself and the team, it's bye for now.